Thank you for this opportunity. This presentation is an extremely high-level summary of 6 in-depth studies relating to small businesses in South Africa. We will give you a little background, a brief note on our methodology, and then a précis of our findings from each paper. At the end, we shall present our recommendations and hope to engage you in discussion. In 2018, the SPP conducted the first phase of SBI's baseline research. We looked at data available in a new way to count South Africa's employing formal, micro, small and medium enterprises, and we will use the abbreviation SMEs henceforth. As a reminder, we found that South Africa was an international outlier. Identifying merely some 250,000 SMEs filing payroll taxes, we found the biggest job creators here, unlike the rest of the world, were large businesses and government. Yes, there are also the solo self-employed and of course informal businesses, but our most pressing challenge, even more so today, is providing work, hence our narrow focus. We also found that no one knew how many companies operated in the formal, let alone informal sector, with guesstimates ranging all over the show. Even the most conservative turned out to be wildly optimistic. South Africa's policies and assumptions have, since 1995, asserted that small firms were the key to economic growth and the employment of millions. Sadly, the research made it clear how limited and fragile the SME segment of our economy actually was, particularly for medium-sized firms, which employ the most people. And now? The best estimates from surveys we have seen over the past year and rising liquidations tells us that somewhere between 15 to 19% of small firms which closed their doors last year haven't opened them since. Many of those that did manage to survive still shed jobs, savings and growth. At the same time, the economy in which they trade contracted 7% and more than 7.2 million people lost their jobs, affecting another 35 million dependents. Because 98.5% of the firms in South Africa are small, a proportion that probably still holds, this suite of papers asks how we can really support them if we hope to enter a period of recovery and growth to tackle poverty and unemployment. South Africa has produced 27 years of plans and strategies to encourage small business formation. Many more have recently been published or are at the printing press. But we need more than plans. To come out of the economic devastation engendered by Covid-19, hard lockdown and business disruption, we need government to develop a sense of urgency, determined to understand and enable what businesses need to take root. A government of decisive action and a government willing to experiment. Each of our papers makes recommendations. We hope some reach the ears of policymakers who are thinking about ways to unleash the dynamism and innovation of our small firms so they may contribute to building the economy. We knew we would need to evaluate the impact of coronavirus on SMEs without reliable statistics. Most lagged by 2 years. This meant we would review dozens of surveys and the work of researchers, journalists, academics, and government report backs. In all, we read hundreds of documents to build a picture of small firms in South Africa today and the policy choices affecting them. We also held conversations and focus groups in our 2 municipalities. Local business champions helped broaden our understanding of the challenges SMEs face on the ground, many clinging to life in municipalities considered dysfunctional. Finally, the research used data available to assess, for the first time, the impact of policy during South Africa's 3 policy eras, underpinning the current conversation in the country around localization, economic growth, and support for small firms. Our first paper, Reflections on the Impact of Covid-19 on SMEs in South Africa, published in October, laid out several key findings, which have borne out over time. These included the disruptions from lockdown severely affected SMEs' liquidity positions, ability to retain staff, pay their bills, and the very survival of many businesses already in jeopardy prior to Covid-19. Consumers, especially the young, were becoming increasingly indebted and made a demand-driven recovery unlikely. Nearly 60% had jobs in small and medium firms employing fewer than 100 people. Providing debt relief with exclusionary qualifying criteria added to the fragility of small businesses and their future solvency. Far too few businesses were beneficiaries of relief. However, international policy responses were more varied, considered, multi-pronged, and longer term than those of South Africa. Many incorporated forward-thinking structural reforms and improvements, both to e-governance and digital support for SMEs. We now know far more about the informal sector than ever before. Thanks to geospatial mapping and digital surveying, for instance, we know there are over 150,000 spaza shops in South Africa, and we've learned how vital they are for food security nationally. Technological developments and innovative applications of programs available to anyone with a smartphone accelerated over the period. Many business owners were able to pivot their businesses to do things differently, and new tech-enabled businesses were developed or grew significantly because of the lockdown. This last finding led us to look at the digital transformation in the paper Digitalization, the Best Hope for South Africa and its Small Firms, released on the 11th of March. The economy of the future offers game-changing inclusive opportunities for small towns and rural areas, not just urban centres. Formal and informal businesses alike can have a real chance to compete on a far more level playing field. New markets, products tailored for consumers they understand better, and with whom they communicate more directly, as well as online selling, are just some of its promises. Government, too, can use technology and information to enhance more transparent, helpful, citizen-centric e-governing. However, government's actions do not mirror their stated objectives to harness the fourth industrial revolution, and we face many challenges, including an inadequate skills base for small as well as big businesses, poor digital infrastructure, uncertain, expensive power supplies, a government locked in the third industrial revolution, policy confusion and too much regulation, as well as budget constraints and sacrifices to the likes of SAA for the agencies driving digital transformation. At the start of this project, our concern was to take a ground-up approach when thinking about South Africa's recovery. So much of the country's decision-making comes from the centre, leading to a detached, often indifferent and ultimately deleterious effect, especially on rural and small towns. We researched Bothaville in the Free State and Mbombela in Mpumalanga, producing a paper called The Importance of Local Champions in Reviving Local Economies. In it, we conclude that despite the dysfunction in so many of our municipalities, a people-centric approach can make a considerable positive difference. Among the concerns identified was the persistent trust deficit between communities and their local government. Only 2%, out of the 257 municipalities in South Africa are functional, leading, among other things, to local community disunity. When it manifests as political infighting, xenophobic attacks against foreigners and foreign-owned businesses, and cadre deployment, the collapse of many basic services people and SMEs depend on for their daily existence quickly follows. One example among the failures of local economic development is its strategy and planning approach. This eliminates the possibility of action-based, opportunity-driven, and flexible ways of addressing problems, which comes naturally to business but is alien to public servants. Another failure is the policy confusion between community development and economic development, amalgamating employment policy, urban or rural development policy, and health policy, amongst others. Simply, the E in local economic development goes missing. National and provincial governments insist on driving top-down projects, which are often more destructive than creative. We show that top-down programs and grants seldom create viable businesses. The issue of sustainability is not considered by officials who have little understanding of business. At the local level, they usually create forced entrepreneurship and overtrading, resulting in anger and frustration amongst beneficiaries of these programs. Corruption Watch compiles whistleblower reports against municipalities and says 35% point to misallocation of resources. Research into the effect of corruption on SMEs in developing countries shows that a 1% increase in corruption leads to a 36.12% decline in small firms' growth in terms of turnover and employment. Corruption is also more likely to happen when bureaucratic red tape is excessive, and more on this we follow on later. But the study found that a 1% increase in bureaucracy leads to a 28.76% decrease in the growth of SMEs. Unless and until officials are successfully prosecuted, corruption will kill, even if it is just the collaborative spirit to build prosperous communities. Local actors, our champions, are the drivers of local development. Businesses and chamber leaders understand that while the private sector creates jobs and drives local economic growth, municipalities must establish the conditions for this to happen. The energy and enthusiasm we document from these champions came in spite of all of the above challenges and others listed in our report. We encourage you to read about all that these community leaders have achieved in their districts and to interact with them, whether you represent a big business in the community or are a public servant. We applaud them and their many contributions to building their local economies. Business organizations are essential catalysts to facilitating what needs to be done and how it can be done, because they live in and understand the dynamics of their local environment. Business chambers, especially strong ones, have an important role. Businesses owned by people living in an area are more invested in their community's future. In New Perspectives on Informality, a focus on the South African context, we turned our attention to the complex issue of informal businesses. How could their positive contributions to the broader economy be celebrated rather than penalized, is the question. Drawing on both local and international literature, we highlight the heterogeneity amongst small firms. We suggest that policymakers should consider businesses along an informal to formal continuum rather than as a binary condition. Informality is not an either-or. Most firms cannot be neatly grouped into one or other category and sit somewhere along the road from informal to formal, or a grey space, as the OECD describes it. Government approaches formalization as a desirable goal, but it stops short of assessing what's in it for small firms. At the beginning of our research, we were asked by an informal business organization why their members should formalize. It's a question government has yet to satisfactorily answer. The focus on registration, compliance and enforcement, which often leads to harassment, offers little corresponding consideration of how costs along the journey to formalization outweigh the benefits. Social protection is a stated benefit for formal businesses, but at what stage of formalization? An informal enterprise may keep books, have a bank account, employ people, but not be registered as a business. At the same time, many formal firms elect to overlook many of the quite literally hundreds of regulations relevant to their sector or turnover or number of employees. In any event, neither formal nor informal businesses were protected from the economic devastation caused by Covid-19, with very few businesses receiving relief in the form of grants, first prize, or loans. In theory, shifting firms towards greater levels of formality should assist them to become more successful and productive. But experiences of South African small firms suggest that moving businesses along the spectrum in an inorganic fashion may not be an effort worth making. No country will ever be without informal survivalist businesses, and as businesses grow and learn for themselves how formalizing advances their commercial interests, they will climb the next step willingly. Tackling the disabling environment to boost economic growth, small business and jobs is the next paper in this series. There is a fundamental question South Africa needs to answer before it will be able to reverse falling employment and rising poverty and inequality. It is a simple question. Is the public or private sector responsible for growth and job creation? The intent of each successive government in the democratic South Africa has suggested it should fall to the private sector, particularly small businesses. And yet crowding around and pushing this clear direction to the side are myriad contradictory policies and actions. The two most harmful results are policy uncertainty, deterring investment, and layer upon layer of regulations created to fix things that don't need fixing, or fix things without understanding the problem in the first place, or fix things without regard for previous attempts. Covid has been an accelerator for an already deteriorating economy, now in freefall. Reforming deeply embedded structural challenges throttling our economy will require all of government, to act in concert to create an environment for growth. It is concerning that the President imagines a small unit comprising Operation Vulindlela, with all the will in the world, has any prospect for success. Regulation and regulatory governance are central to the process of government and fundamental to the performance of an economy. But heavy-handedness can affect the ability of business to do business and add value to the economy. It also constrains the business of government. Over-regulation encourages informal businesses to stay informal and other businesses unable to bear the burden to close. So when do rules become red tape? Red tape is more than just form-filling and administrative burden. Red tape happens when government administrators lose sight of the rules, regulations, and procedural functions and misapply them. It can result in a mismatch between the regulatory intention and administrative processes to implement them. Red tape also follows arbitrary decision-making built into the laws and regulations at the outset of drafting. Many of the common barriers to business growth and sustainability, especially small businesses, talk to the quality and quantity of regulatory change over the past 2 decades, particularly the period from 2008 onwards. Some of these pieces of legislation have run counter to the Constitution. Cumulatively, the proliferation of red tape sabotages the survival of small businesses especially, and their ability to grow productively and employ more people. Findings from studies conducted by SBP found on average that small businesses spend between 4 to 6% of their turnover on compliance with regulatory demands. Among the manufacturing firms, vital for localization policy, which we discuss in the next paper, face compliance costs on average of some 400,000 Rand per year. These are highly regressive costs, hitting smaller firms hardest. Red tape is a symptom of failing regulatory governance, broken systems, and deteriorating administrative capacity, resulting in service non-delivery. In this paper, we illustrate red tape for the waste sector as an example. The diagram we use shows 65 changes in law and regulations implemented from 1994 to 2017 in the waste sector. But these are by no means all. These businesses also have to navigate and comply with corporate compliance, financial compliance, BBEE compliance, the raft of labor law compliance, tax compliance, the licensing regime at all levels of government, and so on. Small businesses have it particularly hard, as in many instances they can often straddle multiple value chains. Harvard researchers have developed a new way to measure trends in governance and in the context of state capability or competence, or what they call the big stuck or capability trap. South Africa, according to their findings, falls within the category of rapid deterioration in state capability alongside 12 other countries of the 102 countries they investigated. Our country is effectively over-regulated and undergoverned. The researchers estimate that South Africa will take centuries to correct state capability based on current trends measured against the country's annual growth. A case in point are the 5,326 applications for mining rights, prospecting rights, mining permits, renewals and cessations, or the sale of rights at the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy. The enormous complexity of their regulatory overreach in the sector, coupled with declining capacity, means no new investment or production or jobs. Regulations cannot and should not eliminate every conceivable risk. It is equally important to monitor and assess the effect of regulations, including the costs of compliance and administration they impose, and the efficiency and effectiveness of the ways in which they are implemented. This paper provides a lengthy explanation of what happened over the years between the Regulatory Impact Assessment RIA system, scrapped in favor of the Socio-Economic Impact Assessments, or SAES. It explains why the quantity of poorly conceived laws and regulations harming the economy has multiplied over the years. The RIA tool, practiced in over 75 countries, required transparent public stakeholder engagement, including with government departments. RIAs were to accompany draft bills to Parliament to allow public scrutiny and ensure transparency. At the same time, departments were encouraged to cut back on the publication of policy and the accompanying RIA to speed up the legislative process. This is consistent with trends seen in the historical data of the volume of legislation passed, measured against the number of policy documents released for public scrutiny over 2 decades. Indeed, in 2007 and 2008, no policy documents were released by national departments. During that time, the RIA was implemented, only one regulatory impact assessment was ever published for public scrutiny, the Labour Relations Act amendments in 2012. Similarly, from 2015, SAES required departments to conduct an assessment before submitting policy and legislative proposals to Cabinet. None, except for the SAER accompanying the National Treasury's draft Twin Peaks Bill, have been published for public scrutiny to ensure transparency and rigour. All businesses play a key role in a country's development, and contrary to what many in government seem to believe, profits are good. They help hire and train people, pay taxes to enable government to afford welfare grants, education, health and basic services. Competition among private firms, SMEs in particular, drives innovation. Businesses are critical partners in poverty reduction. The quality of legislation, markets and institutions can be decisive for a firm's performance and for the performance of the economy as a whole. The handcuffs on businesses limiting their dynamism must be unlocked. For our research to determine local may be lekker, but is it possible, we review the pragmatism of government's continuing and newly aggressive emphasis on localization policy. We begin by segmenting the past quarter of a century into 3 eras, encompassing GEAR, Esquisa, and the NDP. By evaluating changes to GDP contribution reflected in the provincial data and by key sectors, this research has, for the first time, been able to identify the impact and consequences of various industrialization policies pursued by government. We also provide a fact-based assessment of whether small firms are growing or declining in the formal economy. An aggressive localization policy presupposes sufficient capacity already exists in the economy. This capacity is required to produce more local goods and services at prices poor consumers, the majority of our population, can afford. We won't have enough time to provide you with the particulars of the findings, but we shall summarize some of the highlights. In the aggregate, policy to advance agriculture has failed throughout the full 2-decade period, and reversals in mining also indicate policy failure for these industries. Despite a slight uptick during the NDP era, there has been a total decline of all secondary industries in all provinces in the full period. And even though the tertiary industries trend reflect positivity towards their GDP contribution change, the value of this is not an indicator that policies are resulting in any additional impetus for growth. In aggregate, the contribution changes of the tertiary industries are muted when viewed over a 24-year period since 1995. Given this subdued change, we observe a distinct neglect of effective policies to accelerate the stimulation of tertiary industries. During the GEAR period, South Africa's GDP growth trajectory was interrupted by the Asian crisis, but rapidly rebounded to pre-crisis levels and averaged an adequate 3% growth rate. During the Esquisa era, South Africa again experienced an external shock, the 2008 global financial crisis. GDP growth then plummeted to negative territory. In the initial 4 years of the Esquisa period, South Africa experienced sound GDP growth in the order of 3% to 5.6%. However, the recovery post-crisis was muted back to 3% previously experienced in 2003, before the crisis. A marginal growth improvement occurred to 2011. In the NDP era, the GDP growth trajectory shows the consistent downward trend from 3% in 2011 to almost no growth in 2019, 0.25%. Thus, South Africa has not achieved the minimum criteria for GDP growth above population growth for the past 8 to 9 years, nor has it achieved any of the aims set by the NDP. South Africa is classified as an upper-middle income country. This slide shows South Africa at a GDP per capita level substantially above other upper-middle income countries in 1994, and almost at the same value level as the world measure. Upper-middle income countries show rapid growth trajectories over the period to 2019, equated with world values, while South Africa, from its high base of $9,000, demonstrates marginal increases in GDP per capita to $12,500. By contrast, middle-income countries from their low base in 1994 at approximately $450 per capita are presently almost equal to South Africa. So based on their trajectory, it can be concluded that these countries will outperform South Africa in terms of GDP per capita within the next 2 years. GDP per capita performance is hence a socio-economic measure for economic performance and the consequent impact for the well-being of citizens. On a global level, as well as relative to middle and upper income countries, South Africa is failing its citizens economically. Looking at GDP per capita disparities in relation to economic performance between the various provinces, the fundamentals for localization signals failures in policy implementation. These data indicate that provincial strategies need to be reviewed to boost GDP contributions, especially for formulating appropriate localization policies. The analysis of macro-level performance indicators is magnified when viewed from the standpoint of small businesses. Government's policy instruments to achieve localization are primarily focused on public procurement set-asides for the smaller size firms, namely micro-enterprises, based on racial ownership quotas. What is missing in the policy debate is acknowledgement of how we foster the upper band of small firms, described as those that formally employ up to 50 employees, as well as the larger, medium-sized firms, which are most likely to create employment. Our analysis of available SARS data of the number of taxpayers registered for the company income tax, or CIT, shows a disturbing pattern of SME stagnancy. The alarming decline in the number of small businesses in this classification should be of deep concern to government, given that its policy focuses especially on this category. New business entry into the category is declining in profitability and is not sufficient to offset the exit of established businesses over the entire period, our research investigated. Government is now attempting to deepen its localization policy according to the Economic Reconstruction and Recovery Plan, ERP. It plans to expand the list of sectors to support, including those in economically depressed areas, and grow opportunities for targeted sectors and priority businesses in new markets. The ERP specifically targets enterprises in townships, rural enterprises, and SMEs. Implementation of government's localization policy has been ineffective over the years for a number of reasons, which we detail in the report. The new aggressive approach favors priority sectors to access government procurement. There is no reflection on the importance of an enabling environment conducive for all firms in the sector specified and operating in the economy as a whole. The DSBD program to frame and implement localization focuses its interventions without fact-based evidence to substantiate its choices. To expand the current designation of priority sectors from 20 to 200 might be considered a spray and pray approach. To reach the more deprived areas of South Africa, it will require considerable and innovative thinking to improve industrialization where there is little and facilitate support for more productive small firms overall. Interventions based on perceptions alone can lead to policy instruments designed to target selective and often subjectively chosen elements to the exclusion of a sector's broader value chain. Not viewed holistically, policy instruments and interventions have the potential to cause negative disruption. This research has produced evidence demonstrating that ideology, rather than facts, have shaped policies during the 3 eras, failing to grow the economy, failing small businesses, and failing the country. This suite of papers, dense, long, and discouraging, were written to assist decision-makers plan for recovery after Covid-19 and beyond. They provide guidance and evidence from the ground up, from data, and from much consideration of local and international research. The papers were conceived to help us find our feet, dust ourselves off, and start down a new road. Journeys have many forks in the road. We need to learn to stop and turn around if the one we've chosen is heading in the wrong direction. Businesses understand that failure is a feature of growth. Admit it and learn from it. Governments tend to, however, double down rather than to admit to policy failure. For South Africa and all those who live here, we hope this work will provide courage to our leaders to admit it's time to reevaluate ideology-driven initiatives and to try new things the way SMEs do every day. Our objective was to help the country on a growth path that is inclusive, enhances the chance businesses have to succeed and create jobs, and allows us to navigate our way into the digital future and out of poverty. We now turn to the recommendations we have suggested in each paper. We have chosen the most important for this presentation. There are others in the papers, and we urge you to consider them. There are 3 important challenges traversing each topic, and so 3 general recommendations for government. Apart from first, do no harm, these include 1. Strive for transparent, evidence-based policy making. Don't try to provide a solution when the problem is not clearly understood. 2. Lighten the heavy hand of regulation that has shifted from a necessary rule to red tape, which we discuss in the paper on an enabling environment. 3. Sort out our infrastructure, whether a stable power supply, accessible cheap bandwidth, or roads capable of carrying goods to market. Infrastructure maintenance and development is on everyone's lips. Let the private sector help. Incentivize them to do so. In addition, to overcome blockages for South Africa to embrace digitalization, 1. Prioritize long-term investment in digital and relevant software education and skills development for students, the employed requiring retraining, and the teachers who teach them. 2. Seek public-private partnerships in respect of building GovTech solutions to e-governance, innovative institutions, and execution of digitalization. And most importantly, remember, we need data, data, data. Our local champions taught us about their can-do pragmatism, experimentation, proactive engagement, which strengthen cooperation, build trust, and create a sense of belonging. Learn from them. For business chambers, actively foster networking with peers to take hands and share experiences, learning from others who have similar challenges. For big business, explore partnerships, identify and connect with local champions who demonstrate leadership to help empower local communities in the places in which you operate. For government, citizen groups at a local level are taking action into their own hands to fix services and infrastructure in the towns and areas in which they live. Let them help. Work with them to identify priorities, share resources, and together build functioning communities with the basic services people and small businesses need. Develop a compelling reason for and simplified path to formalization for small businesses. Move from a compliance and enforcement regime to one in which businesses can see social and commercial benefits in formalizing. Consider it as a continuum and a journey rather than an either-or binary condition. Enable new pathways and think digital. Ensure by the time people leave school they are employable and have the skills to run businesses. Fund and promote e-learning platforms. The holy grail of an enabling environment is not out of reach. 1. Implement transparent and methodical regulatory impact assessment RIA methods to improve the quality of evidence-based policies, laws, and regulations. For Parliament, strengthen parliamentary oversight. And in this context, we talk about the importance of strengthening Joint Rule 159. 3. For government and business, in partnership, support and conduct a Reduce Red Tape Challenge. We propose a crowdsourced red tape reduction challenge similar to those held in Mexico and in the UK. Engage businesses. Let our small firms tell you what costs too much, takes too much time, or doesn't adequately protect stakeholders. Let them help you to help them to just get on with running their businesses, not developing compliance programs. And before we finish, I think it's time we need to remember Einstein, who quoted, "We cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them." We thank you.